Political order and civic freedom. Christianity's influence on political thought and institutions overlaps with what we've discussed on law and rights, but it extends specifically to how societies structure authority and liberty. In a world that had known emperors claiming divine honors and totalitarian rule, ancient Egypt, for instance, or imperial Rome, Christianity introduced principles that gradually fostered constitutional government, the separation of church and state, and the development of democratic freedoms. The earliest Christian statement on political order came from Jesus himself. "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's." In that phrase was a seed of limited government, implying that Caesar is not God, and there are some things, like ultimate allegiance, that belong only to God. The fact that the Christian Church existed as a separate institution from the state, especially once it was legalized, created a dynamic of dual authority in society. Unlike many cultures where religious and political authority were fused, Christianity maintained a distinction. The Church governed souls and morals. The state maintained civil order. This tension sometimes led to conflict, but it also prevented the absolute domination of one institution. In medieval Europe, for example, popes and monarchs jostled for supremacy. Think of Emperor Henry IV humbling himself at Canossa before Pope Gregory VII after a dispute over investiture. Symbolically, that showed that even an emperor could be brought to heel by a spiritual principle. Conversely, later on, secular rulers would assert their own spheres, as when many princes during the Reformation adopted the motto, "A king is emperor in his own kingdom," rejecting papal political claims. This push and pull ultimately contributed to the Western idea that church and state should operate independently, a concept eventually enshrined in modern constitutions. Notably, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, ensuring government will not establish a religion or prohibit its free exercise, a direct product of Baptist and evangelical advocacy for religious liberty. The Christian doctrine of two kingdoms, the heavenly and earthly, thus helped lay the groundwork for pluralism and limited government. It prevented the state from swallowing all of life. Augustine's great work, City of God, contrasted the city of man with the city of God, implying that no earthly empire, not even Christian Rome, could ever be confused with God's kingdom, and therefore it should not demand ultimate loyalty. Another major contribution is the concept of the covenant or social contract. The Protestant Reformation, especially in Calvinist circles, produced the idea that political communities are formed by covenant under God. The Mayflower Compact of 1620, in which the Pilgrim Fathers agreed to govern themselves by common consent under God's sovereignty, is a classic example of an explicitly Christian social contract. New England town meetings and church congregational meetings habituated colonists to self-government. Likewise, the Presbyterian polity, with elected elders and a bottom-up authority, influenced American revolutionary ideas of representation. Historians have long noted that the American Revolution was preached from the pulpit as much as debated in pamphlets. Ministers spoke of the biblical covenants and applied them to calls for consensual government accountable to the people. The very motto of the American Revolution, "No king but King Jesus," which some patriot soldiers used, encapsulated a Christian egalitarianism. If Christ is the only king in the highest sense, then no human ruler is absolute, and all humans stand on equal footing under Christ's lordship. This religious conviction buttressed the push for republican government. Christian ideas also shaped the development of checks and balances in government. The founding fathers of the United States, for instance, implemented separation of powers partly because they held, as James Madison did, a biblical view of human nature, recognizing original sin. Madison famously wrote in Federalist No. 51, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary," reflecting the Christian notion that humans are fallen and power must be restrained because people are prone to misuse it. This led to a system where ambition counteracts ambition, echoing the Christian realism of Augustine, who millennia earlier noted that earthly city rulers are often driven by the lust for domination, libido dominandi, and therefore need oversight and limitation. Religious motivations were directly present in movements that expanded liberty and representation in various countries. Britain's gradual democratization in the 19th century, extending the vote to working men, then to women, was propelled by many devout reformers who saw such expansion as a matter of justice. Evangelicals supported the Reform Act of 1832 and later suffrage bills, viewing it as consistent with the Golden Rule and respect for persons. In many newly independent nations of the 20th century, Christian leaders played pivotal political roles. One striking example is Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who was educated in mission schools and initially worked with Christian socialists in England. He led Ghana to independence, guided by a belief in human dignity learned in part from the Bible. In South Korea, leaders like Syngman Rhee were Christian. The strong Christian presence in South Korean society provided a cultural foundation for its eventual democratic evolution and respect for human rights. In Poland, as mentioned, the Catholic Church under John Paul II emboldened the populace to resist communist tyranny, culminating in the Solidarity movement that ushered in democracy. Furthermore, the notion of conscience, that individuals have a God-given right and duty to follow their conscience in matters of faith, arose from Christian theology, especially among dissenting Protestant groups like Baptists, Quakers, and Anabaptists. This directly undergirds modern concepts of freedom of thought and expression. Roger Williams, a Baptist minister exiled from Massachusetts, founded Rhode Island in 1636 on the principle of soul liberty, arguing that faith cannot be forced and government should not interfere with an individual's relationship with God. His experiment was one of the first places with true religious freedom for all, Christian or not, in an era of state churches. This radical idea later became a cornerstone of the American Constitution and later human rights law, freedom of religion and belief. Williams' writings, along with those of William Penn, a Quaker who founded Pennsylvania on similar tolerationist principles, were early lights of what we now term separation of church and state and freedom of conscience, achievements fundamentally rooted in a Christian view of the person's direct accountability to God alone in matters of worship. To sum up, Christianity's impact on political order has been to insist that power has limits, for there is a higher divine law, that individuals have God-given worth and responsibility, leading to participatory government and rights, and that the state should not usurp the role of God, paving the way for pluralism and freedom of religion. Our modern ideals of limited government, the consent of the governed, and protected freedoms were all deeply nourished by Christian soil. Global mission and social transformation. Finally, we turn to the global stage. Christianity began in a small corner of the world, but today it is the most widespread faith, present in virtually every culture. As the Christian gospel traveled, it often carried with it the seeds of social renewal we've discussed, adapted to new soils. From the 1st century to the 21st, Christian missionaries and converts around the world have frequently been agents of positive change, abolishing cruel customs, raising educational and health standards, and advocating justice. The story is complex, and not without shadows, but the overall contribution of Christianity to human flourishing on a global scale has been immense. The spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire and beyond in late antiquity already brought change to diverse cultures. When barbarian tribes like the Goths and Vandals converted from paganism, many eventually abandoned practices like human sacrifice and tribal feuding, influenced by the gentle ethics of the Sermon on the Mount and the concept of all being one in Christ. In Ireland, St. Patrick, 5th century, not only brought Christianity, but also catalyzed the gradual end of the slave trade in and out of Ireland. Patrick himself, once a slave, emphasized the evil of the practice. In the early Middle Ages, Christianization of Europe led to the emergence of more unified legal codes often influenced by Christian morality. For instance, many Germanic tribes after conversion modified their laws to be more consistent with biblical norms, protecting the weak, discouraging polygamy, etc. When Christianity later spread to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, it encountered very different civilizations. The encounter was sometimes complicated by Western colonialism. Indeed, missionaries often arrived on the heels of conquerors, a fact that has caused understandable post-colonial criticism. However, it's crucial to differentiate the role of the Christian message from the agendas of empires. While some missionaries regrettably abetted colonial attitudes, many others became the fiercest critics of colonial exploitation and stood alongside indigenous peoples. Overall, the record shows that in many places, Christian missions were a conduit of beneficial changes that outlasted the colonial period. Literacy, modern medicine, and even the seeds of self-rule. One of the clearest examples of Christian missions' cultural impact is the fight against harmful traditional practices. In India, early 19th century missionaries like William Carey witnessed the ritual burning of widows, sati, on their husbands' funeral pyres. Carey relentlessly campaigned against sati, gathering data and lobbying the British authorities. In 1829, largely due to pressure from missionaries and enlightened Hindu reformers whom they empowered, sati was formally banned in British India. Similarly, missionaries in China were vocal opponents of foot binding, the cruel practice of binding young girls' feet to keep them small. They supported Chinese anti-foot binding societies and provided education for girls. By the early 20th century, foot binding was effectively ended, thanks in part to these efforts. In many parts of Africa, missionaries confronted practices like tribal warfare, infanticide, and the suppression of women. For instance, certain African communities would kill twins at birth due to superstitions. Missionaries like Mary Slessor in Nigeria lovingly took in twin babies and taught that there was no curse in twins, helping to end that practice. In the Kingdom of Buganda, Uganda, early converts refused to bow to the king's sexual demands, upholding Christian chastity. Many became martyrs, but their stand impressed others and led to social shifts regarding sexual exploitation and eventually contributed to the more just structuring of the kingdom. Across the globe, where missionaries went, often local language development followed. They reduced unwritten languages to writing, gave them dictionaries and grammars, and translated the Bible and other literature. By doing so, they preserved those cultures and empowered those peoples with literacy. Today, hundreds of languages have written form and literature thanks first to missionary labor. Far from erasing cultures, Christianity in these cases dignified and strengthened them, while indeed challenging elements deemed incompatible with Christian ethics, as any transformative ideology would. Education and healthcare were almost invariably twin aspects of mission work. Missionaries built schools everywhere, from one-room village schools to founding major universities, e.g., Yonsei University in Korea or Forman Christian College in Pakistan. They often were the first to educate girls, as noted before, which revolutionized those societies quietly from within. A famous study by sociologist Robert Woodbury, published in 2012, demonstrated that regions in the Global South that had intensive Protestant missionary activity in the 19th century tend to have higher levels of education, healthier economies, lower corruption, and more robust democracy in the late 20th century than regions that did not. This missionary roots of democracy thesis argues that missionaries spread not just the gospel, but also schools, printing presses, and civil society organizations that laid the groundwork for stable self-government after colonialism. The global spread of Christianity also created new Christian communities that became champions of social reform in their own contexts. In the early 20th century, many leaders of independence or reform movements in Africa and Asia had been educated in mission schools or were the descendants of converts. This gave them a worldview that combined respect for universal human dignity with the aspiration for their own people's freedom. For example, many pioneers of the Pan-African movement and early African nationalism, such as Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya or Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, were mission-educated and took to heart principles of equality and service from Christian teaching, even as they adapted them to African socialism or nationalism. In the U.S. civil rights struggle, the global outcry against segregation was strongly supported by newly independent African nations, whose Christian leaders saw racial apartheid as a sin. One cannot ignore the sheer humanitarian aid provided by modern Christian global agencies. Christian charities like World Vision, Caritas, and Samaritan's Purse operate in virtually every disaster or crisis, delivering relief and hope. In the international fight against human trafficking today, Christian NGOs are at the forefront, driven by the belief that each person is immeasurably valuable. Likewise, efforts to cancel the debts of impoverished nations around 2000, the Jubilee 2000 campaign, were spearheaded by church leaders and based on the biblical Jubilee principle of debt release. It is also a striking contemporary fact that Christianity's center of gravity has shifted to the global south. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia now have vibrant Christian majorities or large minorities. These communities carry forward the legacy of Christian social influence in new ways. For instance, African churches today are deeply involved in peacemaking in conflict zones. Christian leaders mediate tribal conflicts in Nigeria and Sudan, invoking shared faith to foster reconciliation. In Latin America, where Catholic social teaching and burgeoning Protestant churches emphasize justice, we see Christian advocacy for land reform, against gang violence, and for the rights of indigenous people. In East Asia, South Korea's robust Christian population has contributed significantly to the democratization and dynamic civil society of that nation, e.g., Christian organizations were prominent in the campaign to end dictatorship in the 1980s. The growth of Christianity in China, even if largely underground, carries seeds of potential future social change toward more openness and compassion within that society as well. We must candidly note that not every effect of Christian missions was positive. There were instances where misguided zeal or cultural arrogance caused harm, such as the erosion of some indigenous traditions or languages, or alignment with colonial repression at times. Christianity as a movement has never been without sin, because it is practiced by sinners. Yet, the remarkable thing is how self-correcting it has often been. The faith's own principles fueled abolition, fostered cultural respect. Modern missions prioritize Bible translation into native tongues rather than imposing foreign languages, and inspired apologies and reconciliation for past wrongs. For example, Pope John Paul II's apologies for colonial-era Catholic complicity and oppression, or various Protestant denominations' apologies to indigenous peoples. This capacity for repentance and reform is itself one of Christianity's gifts to the world. The idea that we must continually measure ourselves against a transcendent moral standard and seek forgiveness and change when we fall short. In drawing this global survey to a close, one overarching pattern becomes clear. Wherever Christianity has gone, it has challenged cruelty and uplifted value. It has provided a transcendent reference point that has enabled cultures to critique their own injustices and aspire to higher ideals. It has acted, in the words of Jesus, as salt and light, preserving what is good in cultures, adding flavor and new perspective, and shining light on moral truth. After this systematic journey through history, we come back to the present with a clear understanding. The legacy of Christianity in contributing to human flourishing is extraordinary. It spans human dignity in conception, mercy in action, justice in law, and hope across nations. From defending the image of God in each person, to building schools and hospitals, from shaping just laws to proclaiming liberty throughout the lands, Christianity's imprint is deep and enduring. Conclusion. What does this legacy mean for us today, especially for those of us in Christian leadership? First, it should fill us with a humble sense of gratitude and purpose. We see that the gospel is not merely about private salvation, but has a powerful leavening effect on societies. It transforms hearts and thereby transforms communities and cultures. The historical record shows that when Christians truly live out their faith, seeking to love God and love their neighbors, tangible change follows. The hungry are fed, the ignorant are taught, the enslaved are set free, and the oppressed receive justice. This history also challenges us. We stand on the shoulders of saints, scholars, reformers, and ordinary believers who, by God's grace, made the world more as it should be. The question for us is, how will we steward and extend this legacy in our own time? New challenges confront us, from global conflicts and refugee crises to moral confusions and rampant materialism. The same Christian principles that guided earlier generations can guide us. The inviolable worth of each person, the call to sacrificial service, the pursuit of truth, and the hope of ultimate redemption. Our ancestors in the faith were not content to curse the darkness. They lit candles. They founded schools and hospitals, challenged tyrants and unjust practices, and crossed oceans to bring both spiritual and physical healing. As leaders in a spirit-empowered missional context, we are called to carry that torch forward. The gospel of Christ is the most powerful force for good the world has known, not by worldly might or coercion, but by changing hearts and inspiring acts of love. We must ensure that our ministries continue to have a public face, addressing not only the spiritual needs of individuals, but also the social and physical needs of communities. When we feed the hungry, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, or speak for the voiceless, we are not engaging in distractions from the gospel, we are living the gospel. History confirms that such integral mission opens many hearts to the message of Christ. Often it was the Christian school or clinic that softened resistance to the Christian faith itself. Finally, the comprehensive impact of Christianity on human flourishing gives us confidence as we engage the public square today. In debates about ethics, human rights, or community welfare, we do not need to hide our Christian identity. Our worldview has a proven track record of advancing the common good. Far from needing to apologize for Christianity's influence, we can winsomely point out how much of what is best in our world aligns with Christ's teachings. This is not a call to pride, but to informed, bold engagement. It reminds us that our task is not finished. As long as there are people who do not know the love of God, as long as injustice and suffering persist, the mission of the Church remains crucial. In closing, the story of Christianity and human flourishing is an epic spanning 20 centuries and every continent. It is by no means a story of unbroken triumph. There have been dark chapters, but it is a story with a consistent theme of light overcoming darkness. In Jesus Christ, the true light came into the world. Those who have walked in that light have, in myriad ways, brought illumination to the shadows of ignorance, cruelty, and despair in human society. We today are heirs of that great tradition. Let us, therefore, take inspiration from the past, and with God's help, commit ourselves to continue Christianity's legacy of public influence and human flourishing. In our preaching, teaching, leading, and serving, may we so live that others see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven. And may we hand off to the next generation a world touched and transformed by the love of Christ, to the glory of God.